The most dangerous heaters in history weren't loud, flashy, or explosive. They were quiet, almost invisible, and one of them was so effective that governments eventually decided it had to disappear. That's not clickbait, that's history. Coal dust heaters were once a real, working solution to a very real problem. How to survive brutal cold when fuel was scarce, expensive, or tightly controlled. These heaters were simple, brutally efficient, and shockingly powerful for their size. Too powerful, as it turned out. They produced heat so reliably and so cheaply that they raised alarms, not just about safety, but about control. And that's where the story gets interesting. This is the banned coal dust heater. Why it worked, how it worked, and why something so effective was quietly pushed out of everyday use. This is a story tailor-made for the legacy of survival. Before central heating, before gas lines, before electric radiators humming quietly in the background, cold was an enemy you fought daily. In early industrial cities and rural settlements alike, winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat. Coal was the backbone of heating in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But coal wasn't always affordable. It wasn't always available. And it wasn't always clean. What many people forget is that coal didn't arrive neatly packaged. It arrived messy, brittle, crumbling. Every shipment produced waste, coal dust, fine black powder that fell through grates, collected in sacks and piled up in corners. At first it was seen as useless. Too fine to burn properly in standard stoves, too messy to handle. Then someone realized something simple and dangerous. Coal dust still holds energy. A lot of it. Coal dust heaters were born from necessity, not theory. Workers, soldiers and poor households started experimenting. If solid coal burned, why not its remains? The trick was containment and airflow. Coal dust on its own burns too fast and too unevenly. But when compacted, mixed with binders like clay, starch or even water, it became a slow, dense fuel. Pressed into bricks, packed into metal chambers or layered into gravity-fed burners, coal dust suddenly behaved like a controlled heat source. And when it worked incredibly well. These heaters produced steady, intense heat using what was essentially industrial trash. They burned longer than expected, hotter than expected, and far cheaper than conventional coal. For people living on the edge of survival, this wasn't clever. It was life-saving. Here's the interesting part. Coal dust has far more surface area than solid chunks of coal. That means more oxygen contact, more complete combustion, more heat extracted from the same amount of material. In industrial settings, this exact property made coal dust dangerous. In mines and factories, suspended coal dust could explode with terrifying force. But inside a controlled heater, that same reactivity became an advantage. Coal dust heaters didn't waste energy. They squeezed everything out of the fuel. There was very little ash and, honestly, very little smoke when properly tuned. Just heat. Dense, penetrating heat that could warm a small room in just a few minutes. In survival terms, this was near perfect efficiency. These heaters weren't mass-produced with brand names and instruction manuals. They were local designs, workshop solutions, field improvisations. Some used vertical burn chambers that forced air upward through packed dust, slowing combustion. Others used rotating grates to prevent clogging. In military contexts, compact coal dust burners were used to heat tents, bunkers and rail cars using leftover fuel that would otherwise be discarded. There were even experiments with coal dust candles, slow-burning columns designed to release heat gradually over hours. They were simple, rugged, repairable with hand tools, and that made them dangerous in a different way. At first, no one cared. Coal dust heaters were used by the poor, the remote, and the desperate. But as fuel shortages hit during wartime and economic downturns, their popularity grew. That's when problems surfaced. Coal dust heaters were unforgiving. A poorly designed unit could overheat. A blocked vent could produce deadly carbon monoxide. Improper storage of coal dust could lead to fires or explosions. But safety wasn't the only issue. These heaters bypassed fuel markets. They undermined pricing. They allowed people to heat homes without buying official fuel supplies. In controlled economies, especially during wars, that was unacceptable. Coal dust heaters gave people too much independence. Rather than improving the designs or regulating them openly, many governments took the quiet route. Coal dust heating was labelled unsafe. Insurance companies refused coverage. Building codes excluded them. Instructional manuals disappeared. In some regions, possession wasn't illegal, but selling or promoting them was. In others, they were outright banned under fire safety laws. The narrative was simple, too dangerous for the public. The reality was more complicated. Coal dust heaters worked just a little too well outside of those centralized systems. They didn't need pipelines. They didn't need grids. They didn't need permission. And, that made them inconvenient. This isn't really a story about nostalgia. It's a story about, understanding forgotten efficiency. Coal dust heaters remind us that waste is often just misunderstood fuel. Survival innovation usually comes from the margins, not from laboratories. And honestly, history quietly removes tools that don't fit the system, even when they save lives. From a survival perspective, the principles matter a whole lot more than the device. Control airflow, increase surface area, slow the burn, extract maximum heat from minimal resources. Those ideas, they still apply today. Modern heating systems are safer, cleaner, easier to regulate. No argument there. But they're also dependent. Dependent on infrastructure, dependent on supply chains, dependent on systems that didn't exist when coal dust heaters thrived. That's why these designs are rarely discussed. They don't fit the modern narrative of progress. They belong to a time when survival depended on understanding materials, not plugging into a wall. And that's exactly why the legacy of survival keeps these stories alive. The banned coal dust heater wasn't reckless ingenuity. It was disciplined, practical engineering born from scarcity. It worked because it respected physics. It failed because it challenged systems. History didn't erase it because it was useless. History erased it because it was inconvenient. And once you see that pattern, you start spotting it everywhere. If stories like this matter to you, stories about how people survive before convenience, before automation, before dependency, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Legacy of Survival. Like the video if this opened your eyes. Share it with someone who appreciates real-world ingenuity. Because the past isn't dead. It's just been buried under ash.